by AOC. And AOC said, hey, like, don't you think this is kind of bad? Don't you think this is kind of hurtful? I mean, you shouldn't say those things about trans people, right? And Nancy Mace replied, whatever, you know, it's a game. Points on the board. To me, that doesn't suggest a lack of morality so much as a disagreement about when it applies and to whom. To AOC, morality obviously applies to trans people. Like, you shouldn't say those sorts of horrible things about us or try and have our rights restricted. But to Nancy Mace, apparently, we don't really come under the scope of morality. It's just a game. Points on the board. Now, it would be nice if we could all just agree to disagree about whether morality applies to, say, voting. It would be nice if families around the world could come together for the holidays and not fight about stuff. But there is a universal standard that we are all bound by. There is something that affects every single one of us, and that is the amount of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere. I think about this quite often, that some of the classic philosophers we still read today were writing at a time when people didn't know about global warming. I mean, it's all well and good to champion individuality and individual perspectives, but we do, in fact, all live on one very precarious planet, and our actions, including voting, do have an effect on whether or not it remains habitable. It certainly seems like some things should matter from everybody's perspective. I mean, isn't that just science? Well, here's a little story about science. In December of last year, I was in Montana, which is a part of planet Earth. I went into a tea shop in Montana, and whilst I was waiting for my order, I eavesdropped on the conversation that the couple next to me were having. Apologies if you were that couple, your conversation was just too fascinating not to listen in on. They were talking about vaccines. The woman was saying that she didn't trust vaccines, she didn't want her kids to get any vaccines, and here's some quotes of things she actually said that I surreptitiously wrote down in my phone. You trust Western medicine because it's worked for you, but for me, Western medicine killed my mum. I trust my kids' bodies to do what they're meant to do. I'm Cherokee. My ancestors were Cherokee, so I'm very in touch with nature and natural healing. People say to me, oh, you reject science? You want polio to come back? And they're so stupid. Polio was cured because we cleaned up the water. It wasn't the vaccine, so I actually know more science than you. That last point is false. By the way, the cleaning up the water did help with the polio situation, but we did actually beat polio with a vaccine. I'd be doing like misinformation if I didn't tell you that. I was really struck by how often that woman centered herself and her own perspective in the conversation they were having. All of the things she said were about her identity as a woman, as a daughter, as a mother, as a person of Indigenous American descent. Even that last remark about polio was about her in contrast to some imaginary other person who knew less than her. She talked a lot more about herself than she did about things like facts or evidence or studies, and I'm not necessarily bashing her for that, I'm just noticing it and saying that it's interesting. Philosophers might call that perspectivism, and we find a lot of it in Friedrich Nietzsche. Facts and science only matter from somebody's personal perspective. The value of truth is not unconditional. The value of a fact depends on what you want to do with it. Here's some quotes from Friedrich Nietzsche's book, The Will to Power. There is no truth. The concept truth is nonsensical. There are no facts, only interpretations. Now, you might well say, that's just ridiculous, and it's also self-refuting, and you're risking throwing away so much of what humanity has achieved through science and reason. But a Nietzschean would come back and say, no, truth is only meaningful in contexts shaped by our desires, and desire is what life is really about. To deny that is to deny what it means to be alive. In very general terms, Nietzsche thought that society has gone wrong. We're all being held back and kept down by dominant standards of morality. And the cure for this is to try and have a personal psychological transformation, become an individual and assert yourself. Perspectivism is part of that project. Here is another example. Now, you might say that under President Joe Biden, the United States had the best post-COVID economic recovery of any G7 nation. You might say that under Biden, the US economy was pretty good, all things considered, relative to other countries and relative to what it might have been. But a Nietzschean would say, I don't care what the macroeconomic picture says when groceries, gasoline, rent, and health insurance cost most of my wages. Yes, those things are facts, they are true, I'm not denying that, but that truth doesn't matter to what I want to do. There's this trend I've seen where liberals say that Trump supporters are nihilist, that they don't care about anything. But perspectivism isn't nihilism. They do care about some things. Again, like my Trump voting friend doesn't lack values, he just doesn't value all the same things at the same time as me. And if you try to impose values on people as if they are objective, if you try to say, you have to care about these facts, a lot of people experience that as belittling. When we think about freedom and ask, what is freedom? A Nietzschean would say it has two parts to it. Firstly, freedom means seeing your values, your goals, your intentions, and what you want to do as coming from you, chosen by you, rather than given to you by someone else. Secondly, freedom means the ability to reflect on those values and goals and change them if you want to. So now I'm thinking about pronouns, and how a lot of conservatives can get upset about compelled speech when they're asked to use trans-inclusive language. Over the last few years, there's been a greater recognition that queer people exist and that, hello, we're part of society. Hi, nice to see you. We've been here the whole time. And that includes, making a few accommodations so that life is a little bit easier for us. And some conservatives have gotten very upset about that. They see it as something being forced down their throats. Like, it's the new religion, it's the new woke orthodoxy. Say the damn pronouns. According to Nietzsche, every living thing has this drive inside called the will to power. Maybe a better translation would be will to agency or will to freedom. Will to power is the translation that everybody knows, but the idea is that we all want to feel like we are in control of our lives. We all want to feel like we're powerful and strong and the masters of our own destinies. There are lots of ways to fulfill the will to power. Dominating somebody else through violence is a very, very obvious way, but Nietzsche thought there are more subtle ways too. Pity and charity are, according to him, expressions of the will to power. If you help somebody out, you're really just trying to reassure yourself of your own superior status, and you could even call that virtue signaling. Nietzsche was an egoist. He didn't believe in unselfish actions. Even things that look ostensibly altruistic are, according to him, secretly selfish all along. Your mileage may vary on whether or not you believe that. I see a lot of conservatives who seem to think that liberals are pulling some kind of con, whether it's an explicit conspiracy like QAnon or like putting stuff in the vaccines, or whether it's just virtue signaling. They say stuff like, well, you don't really care about global warming or vaccines or queer people or inclusive language. You don't really care about any of those things. You're just using your will to power. It's just a secret ploy for control. And you cloak your will to power in self-righteous moral language, but I see right through you. That's a Nietzschean outlook. They're trying to explain society in terms of the will to power. They're analyzing ideologies like progressivism and trying to tell a story about where they come from and why they're secretly bad. There's this other trend I've seen where liberals and leftists paint Trump supporters as cruel, as delighting in cruelty and causing suffering. And they often point out things like Donald Trump has promised to take retribution against his enemies. But on the flip side, I see some MAGA people portraying that as kind of a good thing, as a willingness to be tough that in some sense aligns with reality. Like, yeah, it's tough, but you gotta be that way sometimes, or it's the discipline that people need, or in some way at least it's an understandable instinct to want retribution. Nietzsche thought that we all have a desire to cause suffering to others that we bury deep down inside us, and he actually thought there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, he thought it has several beneficial effects. The point of punishment, he said, was to make people remember. If you do something bad and you get hit for it, you'll remember it. And so, he says, the desire to cause suffering to one another is the foundation of all promises and contract and economic exchange and even reason itself. It makes people predictable and orderly, and hence it allows us to form goals and make plans based on the expectation that others will behave consistently. So painful, yes, but also kind of necessary. And that's a similar rationalization